this. So actually, I want to start with the present, and then I'll take you back into the past. And as Shaul kindly introduced my paper, I'm writing a book that is called New Day in Babylon and Jerusalem, Zionism, Jewish Power, and Identity Politics from 1967 to October 7th. And I'm trying to draw out some of the historical parallels between the current moment in which we are living and the historical chapter, which I believe was really the first iteration of all the debates that we've had in the last 3 years about the collapse of the relationship between Zionism and the left, the end of allyship. In that time, it was Black-Jewish relations, but I think as I'll try and illustrate a little bit further how that spread to other identity politics groups, and of course the end of unanimity within the American Jewish community around Israel. So what I want to present today is kind of a chapter or part of a chapter of the book that focuses primarily on the summer and fall of 1967, when you might be surprised to learn that things heated up very quickly. But first, let's start in the present with the most current iteration of the question of Israel-Palestine entering into national politics. In this case, I'm thinking about the DNC in Chicago in 2024, which actually started a bit earlier in February 2024 with the Listen to Michigan campaign, which was primarily a movement of Arab Americans opposed to the Israel-Hamas war, which was then joined by the DSA, the Democratic Socialist Alliance, Michigan Congresspeople Rashida Tlaib and Andy Levin, and others, and got support from the Detroit Metro Times. In Michigan, you might be surprised to learn that they received a whopping 13.2% of the primary vote. That's about 100,000 votes, mostly in strongholds like Dearborn, Michigan, which have very large Arab American populations, which earned them 2 delegates to the DNC, the Democratic National Convention. Dearborn Mayor Abdullah Hammoud said, "Gaza is not an issue as only of concern to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, but this is an issue to all Americans coast to coast." Apart from Michigan, the uncommitted movement also had a Super Tuesday event and other primary successes, primarily in neighboring states like Minnesota, which also has a very large Arab American population and earned 11 delegates to the DNC, but as far away as Hawaii, where they earned a whopping 29% of the votes with 7 delegates. These statistics really surprised me when I actually went to look them up to see how much the uncommitted movement had actually swept America in a way that perhaps wasn't recognized in much of our media coverage of Kamala Harris's campaign. Even if these primaries are not necessarily representative of the general election, and of course primaries in America have very specific rules, including town hall style voting that differs from a national election, the uncommitted movement won 17.9% in Kentucky, 14.5% in Rhode Island, 11.7% in Missouri, 11.6% in Connecticut, 9.4% in Massachusetts, and on and on. Onward to the Democratic National Convention itself, before President Biden, or then President Biden, dropped out, the uncommitted movement tried to initiate a dialogue with the Biden administration, but failed. Kamala Harris briefly met with uncommitted leaders at a rally in Michigan, but they couldn't see eye to eye on the issues because she was not inclined to support an arms embargo against Israel. The biggest claim to fame for the uncommitted movement was a call for a Palestinian-American speaker at the DNC, which was rejected by the Harris campaign, although we might recall that the Goldberg-Poland family did appear to resounding applause. Instead, they held a Palestinian human rights panel on the sidelines and a ceremonial walkout of delegates during the roll call. The uncommitted movement has recently received a great deal of attention with the recent release of what has now been known as the DNC autopsy, or the kind of understanding of what went wrong in the Harris campaign. It was very interesting to note that neither the word Gaza or Israel appeared in this over 200-page rather sloppily produced document, and many have really wondered what the role of these issues, particularly the Israel-Hamas war, and the gaining interest in Palestinian and Palestinian human rights and a anti-Zionist component of the Democratic Party is gaining steam, but it really hasn't been recorded in the official DNC, although we're seeing it appear in much more local and sometimes even national elections. But I want to take you back in time to a period of history where we might have anticipated the resounding sweep of the uncommitted movement, even though it hasn't received as much national attention as we might expect, mostly because the changing demographics in the United States and the alliances between identity politics groups really took place in the period between 1967 and 1975, and are just receiving the national attention that has suddenly come to light in the post-October 7th era. As my book discusses, there was a conscious turning away from the Black Jewish alliance with a turning toward a Black-Arab alliance that we can see in the uncommitted movement. But I want first to introduce you to a slightly earlier vignette of history in the fall of 1967, once again in a major conference in Chicago, where the Israel-Palestine issue arose that caused similar unrest, sideline protests, and a delegate walkout. Does that sound familiar? That foreshadowed the events of 2024. Before we actually talk about the National Conference on New Politics at the Palmer House Hilton in Chicago in September 1967, just a bit of background. You might recall that this was a time of great unrest in the United States between 1964 and 1968. There were 329 what were called race riots. I think that term today might need to be revisited in 257 cities. Shortly before this conference, there was also the first National Conference of Black Power in Newark in July 1967. And as I presented at the previous iteration of this conference in London last year, there was also a very big scandal caused by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission when they published a 2-page spread denouncing Israel's imperialist war, which attracted a great deal of attention from the Jewish community and a huge response. I'd be happy to direct you to that paper otherwise. So all this preceded the organization for what was now being called the National Conference on New Politics. And here's what New Politics was described as, according to their organizers. New Politics is an organized effort to return decision-making to the people by providing a democratic way to take effective policy action at a time when conventional American politics of party labels and personalities has become sterile. New Politics encourages the coalition of many different groups and constituencies into a dynamic movement whose combined resources can have impact on the future politics of the nation. Now, this conference originated very much amongst Jewish radicals, or I think they would call themselves Jewish liberals, who were interested in putting together this event. And those included Marcus Raskin, Arthur Waskow, James Warburg, and Philip Stern. And the whole event was meant to be led and bankrolled by Martin Peretz and his wife. And they had hoped to ultimately be able to put together a kind of third political party led by Martin Luther King Jr. and Dr. Spock against Lyndon Johnson in the 1968 elections. But the organization of the conference already foretold some perhaps controversy regarding Israel-Palestine and ultimately the questions of anti-Semitism that later emerged. Martin Peretz, whose wife, whose very wealthy wife, we should say, had generously offered her home in Cape Cod to organize the event, found that even in the early stages of preparation, things weren't exactly going as planned. As Martin Peretz recalled in his book, The Controversialist of 2024, he describes the scene in Wellfleet. He said, "I came downstairs to find blacks and whites together on my porch singing anti-Semitic songs about Jewish landlords overcharging and evicting black tenants in Harlem. Most of the whites singing were Jews, and I could see they were enjoying the kind of vicarious thrill, a subversive titillation that went through them as they sang. I threw them off the porch, but I couldn't escape the issue. All that week, and I argued with James Foreman from SNCC about whether Jewish landlords owed blacks reparations for rent abuses." And on and on. By the time the conference actually arose, things had deteriorated somewhat larger. Unfortunately, I don't know if our PowerPoint is working, but there aren't very many extant photos of the conference itself, so I'm going to try and paint the scene for you. Picture this at the Palmer House Hilton in the city center of Chicago. Those of you may have been to this kind of august, hotel with many wings. It's sort of the destination today for, fancy weddings and maybe your kid's bar mitzvah. But then there were about 3,000 to 4,000 attendees who immediately, remember this is right after, by the way, the DNC conference in 1967 in Chicago, where there have been huge amounts of police violence and clashes between anti-Vietnam protesters and student radicals and the police. So picture this, 3,000 to 4,000 attendees who immediately split into caucuses, including the White Radical Caucus, a Black Caucus, a Whites in Support of the Black Caucus, a White Revolutionary Caucus, a Radical Alternatives Caucus, a Poor People Caucus, and a Women's Strike for Peace Caucus. Outside the auditorium, a bongo group was chanting, "Kill Whitey." Renata Adler from The New Yorker, who wrote a very poignant article about this event, paints a scene of antics from revolutionary rhetoric to quote-unquote isolated acts of mugging in the elevator and vandalism in the hallway, and the coup de grace of revolutionaries who stole $300 from the only people present who defied a genuinely oppressive power structure at great risk and in the name of general new politics from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The keynote of this conference was on the opening night was supposed to be a speech by Martin Luther King, who you recall had by this time begun to shift his views more generally in his politics, but also about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He had supported an ad in the New York Times in late May, right before the 1967 war, but did not carry forward a planned pilgrimage in July 1967 to Israel. So he already was starting to signal a shift in his relationship with the organized Jewish community. On the first night at the Chicago Coliseum, he gave a long speech where he was jeered by black nationalists in attendance. His aide and colleague, Andrew Young, walked out and later complained that, quote-unquote, black nationalists were trying to take over and drive the whites out of the hall. The whites, of course, here in this case, being mostly the white liberals, which was also, at that time, I think we can say, primarily Jews who were in attendance. In fact, already 350 black militants had left to form their own caucus across town. The remaining 400 on Friday met in secret and presented a 13-point ultimatum, which read, "We as black people believe the United States system is committed to the practice of genocide," we'll come back to that in a minute, "social degradation, and to the denial of political and social self-determination of black people, and cannot reform itself. There must be revolutionary change." Renata Adler, again commenting on the use of the word genocide, said the word genocide began to be tossed around as though it could apply to acts of simple rudeness. This may give us a bit of reflection on the way genocide is now being used today. Now, the terms that they wanted were 50% of the representation of the caucus, although they were not, that was not a representative number of those who were present, support for all wars of liberation worldwide, immediate reparation for the historical, physical, sexual, mental, and economical exploitation of black people, civilizing committees to eliminate white racism, and of course, of most attention for us here today, the condemnation, and remember this is only September 1967, of the imperialist Zionist war. Apart from the imperialist Zionist war resolution, an alternative resolution calling for Arabs to respect pre-1967 borders was rejected out of hand. According to Adler, African Americans who wanted to speak against the resolution on the imperialist Zionist war were forcibly removed from the room by enforcers from the Black Caucus. Friedman, another historian, claimed that James Bevel, who was a prominent member of Martin Luther King's associates, sought to speak against it and his life was threatened. Peretz, too, claims that his life was in danger. Upon adopting the imperialist Zionist war resolution, Renata Adler claims the plenary closed by sending a congratulatory telegram to Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. Now, Simon Hall, an historian of this event, charitably refers to this as an ultimatum to test white delegates' commitment to work with the black movement. Renata Adler was a bit more, I guess we can say, blunt in that the adoption of the 13 points constituted a version of white paternalism that would shock a South African plantation owner and characterized it as a complete capitulation. Throughout the rest of the day on Friday, whites engaged in what called a quote-unquote orgy of confession about their childhood feelings towards Negroes. And I don't like using that word, but I'm quoting directly, so I will just use it in that context. We may remember that this comes after Norman Podhoritz's famous exchange in Commentary Magazine about his own childhood, I guess, processing of his of what he called my Negro problem and ours, which was then responded to by other African American writers. Peretz also allegedly witnessed Arthur Waskow yelling to the assembled plenary, after 400 years of slavery, it is right that whites should be castrated. Waskow and others, meanwhile, had apparently worried about whether the Israel Resolution would cause white and Jewish liberals to cut off funding to their organization, although they didn't really debate in great detail whether it was quote-unquote substantively wrong. By Saturday, there was a black nationalist takeover of the National Conference for New Politics, where H. Rap Brown, James Forman, and Floyd McKissick took the floor. In fact, Forman, who was ending his term as the leader of SNCC, marched into the convention surrounded by men with dashikis and declared himself dictator, which Renata Adler commented sort of dryly, that he celebrated the birth of new politics by voting itself totalitarian. Actually, it seems the Black Caucus was entirely shocked by how quickly the rest of the groups folded. And in fact, we're kind of playing a political game of chicken, because they thought that what they were going to do was arrive at the National Conference of New Politics, not have their resolutions be adopted, and then storm away across the street to this other convention that was already in progress, where some of their colleagues had decamped after King's speech. So they then found themselves in a position where actually all their demands had been satisfied, and they could no longer storm out in triumph to proclaim black power and the evils of white liberalism. But it underscored a very important dynamic for integrated and multiracial coalitions. Forman calls the National Conference for New Politics the first real crisis of conscience for Jewish radicals in the left establishment. Martin Peretz, who again was involved in organizing the conference, was a little bit more, I guess we can say, blunt, or much more disappointed. He characterized this event as the worst thing I've ever done, the worst organization I've ever been involved with, and the ultimate example of me being too vulnerable to people and causes on the left. It was a pivotal moment for me. He put particular emphasis on the question of anti-Semitism, suggesting that it completely stunned me, and I wonder why. I felt stupid. And then I see Isabella sitting in the audience here. He said, like the Jewish Soviet poets and party members who were purged must have felt. I remember Anne consoling me that night. She kept telling me this wasn't my fault. And he goes on and on about his, I guess we can say, his guilt about his role in the conference. Now, I think we should put this resolution about the Zionist imperialist war in some context. You may recall that earlier they had already asked for, support for all national wars, liberation, and Maroff telegramming Ho Chi Minh about their successes at the conference. So it's unclear how much the radicals who forced through this ultimatum were truly invested in the idea of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the outcome of the 1967 war, and otherwise. But the Jewish community certainly took this as a marker of what I think we are very aware of now, that Israel and anti-Semitism has often become the price of a multiracial coalition, and we can see this already. I just want to briefly suggest that the American Jewish community was very upset. And they wrote several memos wondering about whether this was a new outbreak of what they called Negro anti-Semitism, but also discussed amongst themselves, can we overreact and can we underreact? Mostly they spent their time telegramming Martin Luther King about his participation in this event, suggesting they were profoundly distressed about the quote-unquote apartheid of the adopted structure and the lack of democratic procedure, the absence of any specific constructive programs, and the anti-Semitism in spite of disavowals, the irrational anti-Israel resolution, all of it disturbing and destructive. Martin Luther King wrote back, suggesting that he had no idea what was really happening there, and if he had known, he would have taken no part, and expressed the importance of reinvigorating the Black-Jewish alliance that was really on the cusp of a major change and later would lead to an almost total collapse. the organized American Jewish community, including the AJC, took the text of Martin Luther King's telegram and then immediately printed it as a press release. But I think what we can see here, although this was really a very inchoate and early version of the events that we've seen subsequently, particularly the uncommitted movement at the DNC, is the price of participation in allyship, whether Israel and even some tolerance of anti-Semitism has become an issue of debate, or certainly even a ticket of admission to a larger multiracial coalition on liberal and progressive causes. I wonder if we had seen these events coming, even as early as September 1967, whether the attitudes may have been different after October 7th. And I hope that I'll be able to elaborate this further in the book, that this article will be part of that project.